Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here with my old friend JoAnn and to talk about this wonderful book. I am standing in for the equally great Amber Hollabaugh, so I hope I'll do her justice in her absence as well. Lynn, when looking through, it's been a great pleasure to spend a whole day reading 30 years of JoAnn's work, or at least bits of 30 years of JoAnn's work, because when you do that, you get a really different view of a person and her work. You get to see what her fears are, what her desires are, what her obsessions are, what things she's still troubling over and she hasn't figured out yet. You know, what gets her up in the morning, what gets her down. And so I have been able, I think, to pick out these threads in her work. But I wanted to just start with one sentence from her piece about Abu Ghraib called Judgment. And it says, how the story begins is, as in every tragedy in which human weakness collides with historical force, a more tangled thing. I would say that's true of every comedy as well, and every tragic comedy too. And I think these things, human weakness, historical force, and in particular the tangled thing, are what JoAnn is obsessed with. She's a kind of connoisseur of the wrong, of the bad choice. She's able to kind of give us a big, sweeping historical background and also get into the very smallest and most complex feelings, ambivalence, facts, all the rest of it. When we, and the other thing is that I'm glad in this very tangled moment of rage and fear and terror, frustration, you know, many, many different feelings, to have JoAnn, because one of her great gifts is that she can simultaneously clarify and complicate. So we, JoAnn and I, we talked before, felt we definitely had to talk about what we don't talk about when we're talking about this book. And that is right now, what's happening in the streets. I was interested to be reminded, looking at the work, that it's equally about pleasure as it is about violence. Violence / power, pleasure, sex, love on the other side. And I don't think we need to talk at the moment exactly about what's going on in the streets. I'm interested to talk about why we should be talking now, or need to be talking now, about pleasure in this time of such sadness and grief. I had one thought that I might begin with, which is I'm up here quarantined in Vermont, and I miss the thrill and the tonic of being in the street with other bodies, which we were missing before. And in particular, this moment, no matter how much rage there is, the sense that you are physically with another and the sense of love that you feel in the street. So for me, that's one of the reasons we need to remember pleasure, because even the angriest demonstration is also a pleasurable, thrilling, loving experience. So JoAnn, why do we need, why should we, how can we connect pleasure to what's going on now?
Well, that's that's a very tangled question, I suppose. The thing is, I was just at a protest in Sheridan Square this afternoon, and I've been thinking a lot in this moment when we're socially distant, just about how, as you pointed out, how essential proximity is, and how proximity is how we live, it's how we feel, it's how we negotiate a city. And if you look on TV, if you watch the protests on TV, most of them are very scary, they're very dangerous, there's a lot of looting, there's a lot of rage. But I was at one in Sheridan Square today, and for everyone, Sheridan Square is sort of the area where Stonewall was born. The Stonewall riots occurred. and you know, the modern gay liberation movement occurred. And there was something about that that was unbelievably sweet. And there was no social distancing. I mean, everyone had masks, but people were near each other. And I think that's maybe one of the reasons for the protests, that people have needed to be near each other. And, you know, I think there was a kind of solidarity is its own kind of pleasure. Solidarity is a feeling of social happiness, social love, you know, social common feeling. And we don't have too many experiences of common feeling. Mostly what we have had, and what my book is concerned about a lot is you know, feelings of what Roger Lancaster calls a poisoned solidarity, where we get together to say, there's the bad guy, let's go get him. And where we feel together by that force. And something about what's happening now is very unsettling, and it's very unclear, but it feels like a break in that. Or at least this afternoon, for 1 second, when I saw this sign that says the first Pride was a riot. You can't think about Pride without love. You can't think about it without sex. You can't think about any liberation movement for, you know, sexual freedom and human freedom without thinking about the gay and lesbian, you know, revolution, basically. And so I guess I think pleasure is essential, because if you don't have a dream, what Robin Kelly calls a freedom dream, you know, on the other side of awfulness, if you don't have a dream of beauty, of tenderness, of love, then all you have is the breaking of windows, or all you have is putting someone away in jail or whatever. There has to be a dream of freedom. And I think that dream is a pleasure dream. So I mean,
yeah, that's a great segue to my next question, and a great answer. The pleasure dream, because I think in a certain sense, you, like me, are a utopian.
yeah,
There's one of a romantic, actually, about sex. I'm going to read from, it's funny, JoAnn, all of the places that I marked excerpts were the ones that you marked. So, so this is from The Secret Sharer, which is JoAnn's really amazing piece of reporting about the Nushan Williams case. For those of you who don't know, Nushan Williams was a young African-American man who was HIV positive and was turned into a monster of HIV spreading in a small town in Jamestown, New York. And so JoAnn went and talked to all these young women who had had sex with him and figured out what the town was. And actually, you come from not too far from there. So this is from The Secret Sharer. Marx was wrong. Sex, not religion, is the heart in a heartless world. It may not turn out well. In fact, it almost certainly will not. Most every girl I met trailed a broken heart somewhere in her short past. If she didn't, it was because she was still with her first boyfriend, or because she had never let anyone get too close, or because at 18, having determined that we are both clean, she was planning for her wedding night after graduation, and heartbreak would catch up with her soon enough. Whatever the case, sex brought the promise of something good, something intimate, something sweet and fleshy and maybe pleasurable. It brought that promise as surely as it carried the darker risk of pain and sorrow. But everything carried that, and more than risk, the plain, lonesome reality. To be held in someone's arms, to be kissed, to be entered, and in the act, forgiven for not being the most beautiful or the most responsible or the most stable, and to be forgiven for the reckless dream of wanting a baby, a partner, a life, to exert that power of forgiveness over someone else. Only sex carried the slim hope of something better. Now, I'm not accusing you of thinking that only sex carries the dream of something better, but I do think that it's clear from your work that you think that sex especially carries the dream of something better, even though we all fuck up, all the time, and it doesn't always get you something, as you say here.
No, and it can annihilate your spirit. I mean, absolutely. That's the thing. It's ecstatic and it's annihilating both. So it's the perfect, I mean, it's really the perfect symbol of life. But go ahead. Sorry, I didn't mean
No,
to.
no, no. Yeah, I'm finished with my question. Go on.
Oh, well, I mean, that story. And so I just want to thank, before, I forget, I want to thank McNally Jackson, and I want to thank John. And I really want to thank Amber Hollabaugh, who was supposed to be here. And I really am so grateful for Judith for being here. But this question and that bit of reading reminds me of Amber, because it was when I was about to embark on the trip to Jamestown that I met Amber, and she was then working at the Gay Men's Health Crisis Center. But I was trying to figure out how to approach a story that had been written like 300 times. It was a huge scandal. I mean, it's not remembered by a lot of people now, but it was a huge scandal. And this fellow, Nushan Williams' face was plastered all over upstate New York. And, it basically was like a wanted poster, and it said, hey, gals, if you have had sex with this guy or with anyone who's had sex with this guy, come down to the local clinic, and your identity will be totally honored, your confidentiality, even though his was completely rejected. And all the stories said, yeah, he was a lethal Lothario, and these women were all victims. And it just seemed too simple. But I was trying to figure out, this inchoate sense of whether, of class and race and sex, and in a deindustrialized town at that moment in the late 90s, in an HIV crisis, an epidemic period. And I met Amber, and she said something that was interesting to me, which was, she said, I think when you're there, you should think about whether this guy was the worst bet for these women or the best bet. And that kind of, it's nice to have your frame of reference kind of tilted. And I think I've always tried to do that. And I think the pieces in the book do that. And so, I went there and I just hung out with these women. And they weren't all people who'd had sex with him, but they were people who knew him or who knew people who'd had sex with him. And some of them had had sex with him. And what I felt was both a sense of, and this is what I felt really through so much. And so when you talk about your introduction, this sense of rage and tenderness, rage at the absolute poverty of people's lives. I mean, what we have accepted, the absolute inequality, the absolute lack of chances, the criminalization from day one, the just the narrow, awful limits of your life. And within that construct, you really did have to see, well, why did these people get together, and how did they get together? And no, he wasn't a monster, and there's no evidence that he tried to infect them. They were all hungry people. They were all, they were all looking for something. They were all using each other. They were all loving each other. They were all hurting each other. It was the mess of life. So the book is called, What We Don't Talk About when we talk about Me Too. But the second part of it is Essays on Sex, Authority, and the Mess of Life. And really, if I had to say what the title of the book was, it's really The Mess of Life and What We Don't Talk About. And that's as true about what's going on in the streets as it is about any scandal, as it is about our political system. It's what we don't talk about. It's what's under the scandal, what's under the Flashpoint event. Because, people aren't out there just because of George Floyd. And Nushan Williams wasn't made a lethal Lothario. He wasn't made a sex criminal just because people were afraid of HIV. It had to do with race. It had to do with class. It had to do with being a drug dealer. It had to do with fear of so many things. I'll stop. I'll stop.
Yeah, those are all a lot of things that we don't talk about, but I'm going to come back to sex. um, you know, you have sort of two kinds of writing. One is this, very, very dense report edge. And then there's another part that's more kind of essayistic, more personal essay, and in which I think that a feeling you have, and I could be wrong, is that sex in some way, that sex is both very different from everything and also not very different at all from everything, and which I agree with you. But I'm just going to read you, I was just reading an essay by Sigrid Nunez, a review about Garth Greenwell, who's this writer who writes a lot about sex, a novelist. So this is quoting from Greenwell. There's no fathoming pleasure, the narrator tells us, the forms it takes or their sources. Nothing we can imagine is beyond it. However far beyond the pale of our own desires, for someone it is the intensest desire, the key to the latch of the self. And then Nuno says, I wouldn't argue against such well-said wisdom. What I've always been highly unsure of, though, is just how much a person's sex life defines who that person is, and how much it can really tell us, or even the person themselves, about the rest of their being. I will never be convinced, as some people apparently are, that we are our most ourselves when we are in bed. Indeed, it seems to me that the number of people for whom this might be true must be quite small, or that much can be known about a person from the way they perform or fail to perform the sexual act, or by their individual erotic tastes.
Oh, I disagree completely.
Yeah, so I want to ask you to comment on that. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I disagree because, okay, so it can be the worst thing, it can be awful, of course. It's like life. It is this essential thing. It can be absolutely awful, and then it can be kind of transporting. But why it's like the secret conversation. And I think, I don't know, I just think that people who cannot converse in any other way, who cannot be vulnerable in any other way. So let's say men, okay? Let's say straight men. Straight men often, the only way they can talk is through sex. I mean, the only way they can be honest, the only way they can be weak, the only way they can be needy or angry, or, well, angry, no. I mean, but I mean, it's the thing that's not allowed them in any other realm. I mean, the thing that's allowed men is to be violent, is to be nasty, is to be angry, is to be cold and indifferent. And so in sex, you get to shed your skin, and so do women. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that, I mean, I think that there are people, of course, who will never do that, who will always withhold, who will, who've sort of watched too much Shonda Rhimes or anyone on TV where sex is just nothing but a hump job, but most of the time, let's just say a kiss. Let's just say a kiss. You know so much about someone from the way they kiss you. And you ought to know then when you want to have sex with them, or whether you want to go further. Because if they can't kiss, I mean, to your satisfaction, if it's not a pleasure to kiss them, it will not be a pleasure to do anything else. But I mean, I just think it's such a language. I mean, the language of love. We've lost the language of love I think in popular discourse. We don't talk about it enough. We talk about the language of hate, and we talk about violence and all that. We don't talk about the language of love. It's a sort of lost language. And I think that as messed up as things can be, in that, for instance, the portion you read from The Secret Sharer, I mean, I just saw these people who were just so hungry for human contact, for proximity, and for some moment of true feeling. And I mean, the moments of true feeling, that's living. That's living. So sex is kind of like, it what is it? It expands that, or it makes it very small, whatever. It's a microcosm of that.
So while we're on the voluptuary, I want to
The
talk about
voluptuary, did you say?
the voluptuary. Yeah. Well, I
Yeah.
want to talk about Catholicism.
Well, yes. Okay. So
So
tell us.
Catholicism, I mean, one of the other things that you learn when you read someone is the image that often there's an image of themselves that they repeat. And you know this is an image that they love about themselves. And one of the ones is you as a little sassy, sort of dirty-kneed, maybe dirty-minded, Catholic working class girl with a whole bunch of brothers. And there's a great
one brother.
one brother.
I hope he's here tonight. I hope he's here.
And there's a great little anecdote that you tell in the review of my book, actually, where you're with your other Girl Scouts and you're about to get the Marion Award, whatever the hell that is. And you have to go to the priest who's going to interrogate you about what's between your legs and so on. And you stand up and you say, I fail to understand what these questions have to do with the Marion Award. Come on, girls. And then you all run out giggling. But Catholicism, I actually do want to read a little part that you write about Catholicism. This is in the piece about Paul Shanley. JoAnn wrote 2 wonderful pieces about Father Paul Shanley, who was also another sex monster who was not a sex monster, who was a very complicated man, and the piece really gives a very poignant sense of who he is. And it's about Catholicism too, of course. The long winds of change that have unmoored secular relations have created a special predicament for the Catholic Church, one not easily solved by introducing marriage into the priesthood as reformers fancy. In parallel to organizing patriarchy and patrolling the ramparts of right loving, all religions do that, Catholicism has had, in the form of its priesthood, a queer culture for 1,000 years. Whether individuals or homo or hetero is beside the point. Here's an institution removed from the everyday construction of straight masculinity, a community of men living together, freed from admonitions to marry and multiply, engaged in ritual and performance, praising gentleness, wearing dresses, and bound together in a worship of a naked man on a cross. Body and blood, the heady mixture of rapture and camp, at once repressive and voluptuous, mortifying and incarnational, that culture is now stripped under attack. And then later you say, the problem for conservatives is that they love the church culture of the marvelous and hate the sensibility that has largely sustained it, which is this homoerotic sensibility. You also love the marvelous so does Catholicism affect who you are as a writer, as a person? And
I think, it's funny because I had not, until I was putting together this book, and I thought, my God, you're such a Catholic, and it hadn't quite occurred to me because, before I started writing about sex and all through, I've written about politics and labor and union politics and strikes and all kinds of things. But sex, of course, brings the church into focus. And then I have written about, as you say, the pre-scandal. I think, I grew up at a time when, in that fulcrum time, when it was changing, when you could still have Latin Mass, when you still had a language you didn't understand, and when things were sung that were beautiful and mysterious, and there was so much sensuality, the flowers, and I write about that so I reviewed Harmful to Minors, and it's a review essay, and it's in this book too. And Harmful to Minors is a spectacular book that Judith wrote. But there was this, and she writes about how children children have to understand, have to be allowed the pleasure of their senses. And that means a lot of complicated questions too. But I just thinking when I was reading that book about my own childhood, and these brocades and the Infant of Prague and the candles and that you know, May devotions, you know, we'd go to May devotions and they were all in Polish and it was beautiful and it was a beautiful language and it was always, you know, and I think some of my writing is maybe influenced by that, you know, the rhythm of it, the incantational kind of quality of it. So yeah, so it's beautiful, you know, it's it was, there's a lot of beauty there. There's also a lot of damage and repression there. And I wasn't really a dirty girl, actually. I was a girl of my mother's making, you know, and my mother, and this is really important, I think, in how we think about how we raise children and whether, you know, whether people can say no and whether how people relate to authority, because authority is another real subject in this. And so that moment, you know, I certainly didn't know what I wasn't really sure what this priest was doing. I mean, he was supposed to be asking us about the Virgin Mary, and he was asking us about virginity, and then what's between your legs and all this. And I'm sort of toward the end because I'm Wypijewski, you know. And so I was just preparing, like, what to do. What would my mother say? And so my mother had always said, you know, that everyone's authority over us was kind of conditional, you know, and we could challenge them, but we had to be really polite. And we had to stand up straight and we had to put our chin up. And that's my memory of how I behaved. You know, Father, I failed to see what that question has to do with the Marian Award. Girls, let's go. You know, because I just knew we had to get out of there. It was wrong, you know. But then I didn't tell her. I didn't talk about it. My girlfriends talked about it. We told the scout leader, because we were all in our little Girl Scout uniforms. And he was drunk and he died a few years after in the middle of the street of a heart attack. But I don't know what happened. But I think that certainly I had a lot of questions. You know, Catholicism raises a lot of questions, but contradictions. I mean, there's tremendous contradictions in the religion and in the ritual and in the eroticism of it. But what it is solid on, what it really is solid on, is this question about mercy and this question of forgiveness and the question of love. And I really think, you know, you have to, especially when you're a journalist, I mean, I think you have to approach any situation with skepticism, but I think you also have to approach it with a kind of human love, you know, with a human love for another figure, for another, it's a meeting of two figures. And that's a kind of common love, you know, and that stays with me. Oh my God. This is our emergency telling us that the curfew is on, or it's about to be on. So yeah, I think that this question of mercy, forgiveness, we don't believe in forgiveness or mercy as a culture. I'm not sure the Catholic Church does anymore either. And I think we need to be merciful. I think we need to have some sense of forgiveness. Debbie Nathan, our mutual friend, a great journalist, once said something about, you know, in the prison system and the, you know, what we do with people who are accused of sex offenses, who are convicted of sex offenses. We basically exile them and say that you are the totality of your worst day. You cannot ever make a mistake. You have no human right to make a mistake. You will never be forgiven. You can never pay it back. And so what that suggests, society that is about nothing but vengeance and punishment and just hurt. And so I think that the thing I hold to my childhood, apart from my mother's lessons in self-possession, is really this very strong sense that, you know, that a punitive culture, a punitive society, a society where one is to be labeled forever by their worst day, and where there is no forgiveness, is a dead society. It's not a live society.
Well, it's interesting that, I mean, I think you work out a lot of this contradiction, you know, in this sex offender world, this idea that you are the worst thing you've ever been, you know, ever did. But among the only places that you can go is to evangelical Christianity, which opens its arms to all kinds of people who have done wrong because it believes in redemption. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, though, you have to believe all this other stuff that comes with it, which is partly, I hate myself because I did this horrible thing, like have sex with another man, for instance, with a boy. And so, you know, that tension, I think is, I guess, do you still feel like a Catholic at all?
Yes. Yes.
And how do you feel like a Catholic? Aside from this thing about mercy and love.
I mean, I think that's pretty fundamental. That's pretty fundamental. That's, you know, and also the sensuality of the church. I mean, it's not achieved very often now in practice. And so you're always disappointed. Like if you go to mass, you're almost always disappointed. So in your mind, it's this sensual thing. But love one another is a really pretty radical idea. It's a pretty necessary idea. And it is an idea that I remember when I was covering the trial, or what was supposed to be the trial in the Matthew Shepard murder, and that's also in this book. There was this guy, Fred Phelps, who's this fundamentalist crazy guy, and he was having a protest with all his numerous children and grandchildren, etc. And they had signs saying God hates fags and one thing after the other, horrible slurs, you know. And I asked him what was the basis for his you know, his theology. And, you know, he said, "You're trying to trick me now." And I said, no, I'm really curious. Oh, I asked him whether he loved Jesus. I asked him whether he loved Jesus. And he said, "You're trying to trick me." And then I said no. And then we got into it a little bit. And then he admitted that he liked a lot of the Old Testament. And I said, well, what about the fact that, you know, Jesus was once asked, the reason I asked about the Jesus question, Jesus was once asked, you know, what's the law? And in the Bible, Jesus says, well, there are only two, you know, love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy mind, all thy soul, and love thy neighbor as thyself. And so he said, Fred Phelps said, "You would like that one, wouldn't you?" And I said, well, more to the point is that you don't like it. You know, you don't like it. So that's why I asked you whether you were Christian. But I mean, the other thing I feel about, you know, you asked me if I was Catholic, you know, if I still feel Catholic, you know, I've always had this secret, and now no longer secret, I guess, idea that you know, the best argument for God's existence is the female orgasm. So, so I think, yeah, so I think that's, I'm not sure that's a Catholic thought, but it's a theological concept.
Jewish, frankly.
Yeah.
It's my
Right.
So I'm going to get a little bit back to, well, do you think your sense of justice is justice? And I think justice is a very important theme, another theme of yours. And for instance, there's this great piece about the Kavanaugh hearings and about Kavanaugh and about the difference between the sort of the letter of the law, you know, the kind of juridical sense of justice, and the bigger sense of justice, which is not ordinarily really dealt with in a courtroom. It's somewhere else. My partner, who grew up Catholic and was an altar boy and the whole rest of it, said what he got from Catholicism was a sense of justice. That's what he came at from it. So I don't know if this has to be about Catholicism, but I'd just like you to talk a little bit more about justice. And do you have, I think there's a feeling now like we cannot have any confidence anymore at all in the judicial system. I mean, now we have this horrible court and so on. But I also get from you like a very deep sense of the importance of, for instance, the Bill of Rights, like a love of the Constitution in a certain way. So talk about justice and system.
Well, so okay, so there's legal justice, and it's very limited, right? It's a very limited. It's a very limited aspect of it, um, but it's important aspect of it too, especially as in the context of scandal and in many other circumstances, we as a culture have abandoned the presumption of innocence. And abandoning the presumption of innocence is a terrible, terrible uh, uh, crime against humanity, really, because it basically says that the victim must it must be believed in every circumstance, and the victim is to be raised up onto some pillar, and the accused really has no claim for her or himself. He or she, if she's or he is accused of something awful, immediately they are assumed to be guilty. They are assumed to have to prove their innocence and their worth and their humanity. And so this is a terrible trial by media. I mean, we've all seen it. I've dealt with it a lot. The book deals with it a lot. I mean, media panics, moral panics are very much part of this book. So I've watched these court dramas, and court dramas always reveal something. They reveal human weakness. They reveal human gullibility. They reveal human complicity, and they reveal complicity of structures in which certain individuals then are put in the dock and are made to stand as symbols. So you always have to separate legal justice from some concept of what would be fair, what would be just, what would be right. And of course, a trial isn't that. A trial is kind of a competition of stories. My friend Bruce Jackson says, a trial is not about the truth. A trial is who tells the best story. But there still have to be some, so it's limited, but there still have to be some rules which we all agree on. And I think if the accused are not given the presumption of innocence, if they're not given due process, I think that's a horrifying stain on a culture, because what it says is that we can put you away. We can put you away forever. I mean, the power of the state can come down on you, and we're all complicit in this. We are all in agreement that some people are just too monstrous, and they really, the trial will just be a sham. It will just be a show. So I'm particularly incensed by trial by media, because frankly, we don't know anything most of the time. We don't know anything. We like to pretend we know everything. And, whenever we talk to a human being, they tell us a story, and that story is going to be, shaped, it's going to be shaped by what they want you to hear, how they want to represent themselves. And as journalists, we can never really know the truth of this or that, but there has to be some way in which there's a, you put things into context, you put things into perspective, you look at the welter of evidence, you wonder who would do this, and then you think about all the ways that people are weak, and all the ways people are contradictory, but also all the ways that people might lie and might try to protect themselves and defend themselves by saying something that's not true at all. Because we have seen a lot of false convictions. We've seen a lot of false narratives. And that's not something that we can say, oh, well, that was just there. No, that happens all the time. And I'm struck by, I was struck in the Me Too movement, which now is kind of on the rocks. This concept is on the rocks a bit because of Tara Reid, and everyone's saying, well, now do we believe her? Well, no, maybe not her, you know. But there was this conception really that women aren't people too, you know, that women don't lie, that women don't cheat, that women aren't needy, that women aren't recalibrating their, you know, their stories for public consumption. They aren't seeking justice as a means of actually seeking vengeance. I mean, men do it, women do it, trans people do it, all people do it. This is a human thing. And if we don't allow people their humanity, I mean, if we don't allow people to be the worst that they might be, we can't really allow them to be the best they can be either. So I don't know, that doesn't answer the question. Justice,
that's a very good, I think that's a very good ending. And I want to say one last thing, which you really spoke about just now. And one of the things that I love most about your work is a tolerance of irresolution. And that sometimes in your pieces, I mean, you dig the way any good journalist does, and you don't, there are just things you can't know, as you just said. And you're able to say, well, you know, maybe he was this, maybe he was that. You know, we just don't know. And that to me is like much more like real life than what journalism always tries to pretend it is, which is somehow this kind of merchant of the truth. And yet there are, as you're saying, different kinds of justice. There's different kinds of truth as well. And one of the truths is you don't always know. So, so I thank you so much for your work, and I love you so much, JoAnn.
I love you too.
Fun. I think it's time to let the audience ask you some questions.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Judith. On one day's notice, an incredible host. I have a really good question from the chat. JoAnn, how do you see the reemergence of mercy in a world so defined now by vengeance and punishment? As a millennial queer person, it's hard to feel like there is any world where everyone can come back together under the banner of mercy. What would you say to that?
I think that's for your generation. That's the work of your generation. I think it's the work of every generation, actually. I think how we can be human is the work of every generation. And there's a line, there's a piece that I have in the book at the very end of the book, and it's an appreciation of James Baldwin. And it's a line that he has, which is, well, I thought I had it right here. He talks about how one separates oneself from habits of thought that sustain and reinforce the habits of power. I got that a little wrong, but it's essentially that.
Reinforce and sustain.
Okay, reinforce and sustain. So, and I think that's, so the book is not an action agenda, as Judith just said. It does not do that. But what it tries to do, and what I think it puts on all of us, what I've tried to do my whole life, and what I would suggest that you and everyone, you know, try to do all their life, is just try to separate oneself from the habits of thought that reinforce and sustain the habits of power. And if one of the thoughts that reinforce that absolutely is this notion of punishment, is the kind of idea of is the lure of a poisoned solidarity, is the thrill of getting the bad guy, you know, but we're not safer because of that. We're not healthier, and we're not happier, and no one is better because we're prison America. And I think part of this protest in the streets now, and you can hear the sirens probably, is about is against prison America. And I think the ground is moving a little, and so I think it's on all of us to resist the common sense of the time, when the common sense of the time is about having no mercy. uh, and uh, and then you move. Then you move
I
in
know
ways that you, in whatever ways you can.
I know that you had an article in The Nation under the same name as the name of your book, but you did also say that in the book there's writing that, or reporting that goes as far back as Matthew Shepard. How long do you think this book has been inside of you? How long have you been waiting to write it, or writing it, or thinking about writing it?
Oh, I mean, I started writing about sex in the early '90s, and then I started following scandals. So really, I just this has just been part of my work, and I thought that it should be in one place, and I thought that even though the scandals or the stories that, they're all particular stories, but what they really are about is human experience, and where I think, why I mean, I wouldn't just foist my work on the world. I think that there is a way in which a story that is from 1996 or 1991 or 1998 or whatever, still resonates, is because it raises those questions. It raises the complications and the contradictions of human life. And it talks about sex, which we're, after all, which is one of the great things about being alive. I mean, we have to, to the extent that we love food, that we love the sunrise in the morning, we have to have some joy in the fact that we are human bodies, that we can feel these things. And so if we can feel these things physically, we have to feel these things emotionally. And can we love each other? I mean, that's just such a big, can we? Probably not. Life is, I have a kind of tragic view of life, but I think you try, because I was telling Judith before, when we were talking, that there's this poem that's been going through my mind, and I've been carrying with me in this period, this crazy, dangerous, disorienting period. And it's by Mahmoud Darwish, and it's called "We Love Life Whenever We Can." And it's really a very tragic poem, because it's about the Palestinian experience. It's about being dispossessed. It's about being defiled. It's about being despised. It's about burying your dead. It's about that sense of uneasiness, but nonetheless, there is this line that keeps recurring: we love life whenever we can. And I think that's our duty, and to help everyone else do the same.
Right.
Help everybody else do the same, which is a political project, by the way. It's a political project. It's not just like a airy fairy thing. It's like, how do we think about freedom? How do we think about liberation? How do we think about the society we want? How do we think about something better? That's fundamental. That's the meaning of our lives.
I think we have time for maybe 2 more questions. There's a good one from somebody who is maybe admiring your shelves in the background, which is, could you name 3 writers that you enjoy or consulted, one about sex, one about authority, and one who writes well about the mess of life?
Oh gosh, well, I love Baldwin. I really do love Baldwin. So on the back there's the price of the there's Price of the Ticket, which is his collected work of nonfiction. But I also love a novel he wrote called Another Country, which was in 1959, which, everyone, and, this gets back to a question Judith asked, everyone in that book eventually has sex with everybody else. And it, but really what it is people groping their way to some kind of authenticity. Who are they? Who can they see each other? and they really can't see each other. And there's so many reasons they can't see each other. And it's race, and it's class, and it's experience, and it's just who they are. And they're all, and it's 1959, so there's this sense of the time that's really shaky. So I would say that's a great book on sex and on the mess of life. Um, I I love, and this, I don't know that it fits in any of these things. You know, my favorite book is Moby Dick, and it's just the pure beauty of the language and the tragic nature of the tragic story, but within it, all of these human complexities and solidarities, and the idea of work and of people together. And it gives you a sort of tenderness for humanity. And on sex, oh God, I should have some answer there, but I don't. I don't right now. I wasn't expecting this story.
And then the last question is
I
from.
mean, you know, you like. There's a lot of there's a lot of erotic work. You know, there's you know, my great friend John Scagliotti did a movie called Before Homosexuals, and he talks to this woman who has studied, you know, lesbian love spells. And you know, there's so much eroticism in art, there's so much eroticism in language, but I can't pick a book per se.
And the last question is about language, and it's from Debbie Nathan, who you referenced earlier tonight. She writes, the current protests are, among other things, so heady, full of life, and so courageous, especially in states where the state has provided no real public health, but hyper right-wing rhetoric about Antifa and cops ready to bring out the weapons and gas and pepper. At the same time, these young people, so full of juice, are routinely violating social distancing. What language can we use to speak of heroism and communality and solidarity and love, and also the terrible risk? In terms of that, and maybe in relation to the book too.
I think risk is the nature of life. And I was just in Sheridan Square, and nobody was social distancing. Almost everyone was wearing masks. That was interesting. And I've heard from a friend in South Carolina that 90% of people there were wearing masks in a protest. And I think, I don't know whether this is, I think there's sometimes when you have to take the risk of proximity, and I think this is one of them. I think it's one of them. Because there was something so beautiful about that just this afternoon. Now, I don't think there was, and no, I think, you know, people weren't talking to each other. I mean, they weren't, you know, face to face. I think there's a certain kind of safety, but there's not. I mean, and they're very young, and of course they're very young, and they think they'll live forever, and you know, we all know that they won't. But I have to say, I would not be the one to say. I would say you got to be careful about the risk of being beaten by the police, and you probably shouldn't just bust up shit, because I understand the feeling for it. I understand the rage, and I understand the impulse, but that's going to hurt you. The man's going to come down on you. So, but I think you have to take the risk for solidarity.
Well, it's a wonderful place to end, and thank you again to Judith for stepping in and really leading a great conversation.
And thank everybody for coming. I mean, I don't see you, you know, it's so strange, because in a bookstore, you know, you get to hold up you get to hold up this very handsome book, by the way.
It is a
And
very
then you get to sign it, and then you get to talk and schmooze and touch. And it's a very hard thing not to do. And it's something that I miss. And I wish I could see you all. And I'm so, so grateful for you to be here. Thank you, for everyone who showed up.
So much.
And buy the book.
Put on the gallery.
And buy the book.
And then you'll see everyone.
Oh yeah, you can switch it back to the gallery view. And you can see
yeah.
everyone.
Thank you so much. It was really wonderful, fabulous.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.